Morning, everybody. Oh, that sounded a bit echoey. Welcome from me as well, a bit late on. If you don't know me, I'm Elaine. I think nearly everybody in here knows who I am. You've got the short straw this week. You've got me, because Kevin's not around today. They're away this weekend at a family do, and he's back in the office tomorrow. But he asked me, would I preach today? So, Alan's already sort of said what I was going to say, the keep it simple, stupid. I remember that in one sort of inset day at school when I was teaching. That was sort of the theme, to try and keep things simple. So that's what we've got, keeping it simple. And over the past 5 weeks, Kevin has been taking us through a series called Faithful, looking at how we can fuel our faith in a world that's on empty. And he's going to finish that series next week. So I was given the opportunity to choose whatever I wanted, which sounds great. And then you think, well, how do I choose, and what do I choose? So I thought about it, because he gave me plenty of notice, which was good. I thought about it and prayed about it for some time. And then I remembered something, or maybe the Holy Spirit put that in my mind, something that was in the very first of those sermons, when Kevin talked about 2 occasions when Jesus was amazed. And Jesus was amazed at faith on 2 occasions. The first one was a centurion who wanted Jesus to heal his servant. And Jesus was amazed at the strength of his faith. And the second one was the people of his hometown of Nazareth. He was amazed because they didn't have faith. He was amazed at their lack of faith. And I then thought it was worth looking into that story in a little bit more detail. So we're going to stay with that faith theme. Now, I put out a few Bibles. If you want to have a look at it in more detail, I'm just going to summarize it. If you want to look at it, it's on page 1030. The story in Luke's Gospel has a little bit more detail. And in summary, this is what it is. There's a map here. I'm not sure how well you can see things on here. This is a map of Palestine at the time of Jesus. And on here we can see Nazareth, where that yellow arrow is. There's Nazareth, and that's Jesus' hometown. You can see it's just to the west of the Sea of Galilee there. And he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he stood up to read, and they gave him a scroll, and he found a passage from Isaiah, and he read it, a very short passage, and then he sat down. And the custom was, in those days, they would stand up to read, and they would sit down to teach. So they're all waiting for him to say something amazing. And he explained to them that scripture had been fulfilled in their hearing. And at first they were all amazed at what he'd said, and, oh, didn't he speak well? But then they started questioning. They said, and this Joseph's son, who does he think he is? And Jesus went on to say that the people there were expecting him to do in Nazareth what he'd been doing, what they'd heard he'd been doing in nearby Capernaum. So there is Capernaum. So right on the top edge of the Sea of Galilee. That was quite a busy, bustling, cosmopolitan hub, and that's where Jesus had been doing a lot of his ministry till then. But then Jesus added, the prophets were not welcome in their hometowns, and he gave 2 examples of miracles that were done by the great prophets in the past. And he said, despite there being many widows in Israel at the time of great famine in the days of Elijah was only sent to 1 widow, and she was in Zarephath in Sidon, right up there on the coast, in what was then Phoenicia. And he said there were many lepers in Israel in the days of Elisha, but only 1 was healed. You've heard his name already, Naaman the Syrian. and they're Syria, and it's still there today, and the capital is still Damascus. And both of these examples were non-Jewish people, and worse than that, they were enemies of Israel. And the people became so furious that they drove Jesus out of the synagogue. They charged him up to the edge of the cliff, because Nazareth is built on a hill, and they took him to the edge of the cliff, and they were going to throw him off and kill him. But Jesus just walked straight through them and left. So that's the background. That's where the idea came from. And I looked at that story and I thought, Now, Alan asked you to put some hands up earlier. These might be slightly more embarrassing questions, but if you feel able to, please do. Who's heard of Elijah the prophet? Good. Lots of people heard of Elijah. I think everybody. Who's heard of Elisha? Yeah, there's one or two hands not gone up there. That's interesting. Okay, you don't need to keep them up, and we'll not look round and check who's done their homework. Bit cruel, isn't it, when I don't tell you what the lesson's about and you can't prepare. Right, who knows the story of Naaman, the Syrian? Yeah. But it's probably quite a long time since we heard that story, and it's worth hearing it again. And we're going to have it read to us. There's lots of characters in it, so too many characters to do a proper dramatised reading. But Alan and Arthur are going to read us that story, and it's from the Message. Let's just listen to it from the Message, and then if we can refer to it later on. Thanks, Arthur and Alan.
Naaman was general of the army under the king of Aram. He was important to his master, who held him in highest esteem, because it was by him that God had given victory to Aram, a truly great man, but afflicted with a grievous skin disease. It so happened that Aram, on one of its raiding expeditions against Israel, captured a young girl who became a maid to Naaman's wife. One day she said to her mistress, "Oh, if only my master could meet the prophet of Samaria, he would be healed of his skin disease." Naaman went straight to his master and reported what the girl from Israel had said.
"Well then, go,"
said the king of Aram.
"and I'll send a letter of introduction to the king of Israel."
So Naaman went off, taking with him about 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothes. Naaman delivered the letter to the king of Israel. The letter read,
"When you get this letter, you'll know that I've personally sent my servant Naaman to you. Heal him of his skin disease."
When the king of Israel read the letter, he was terribly upset, ripping his robes to pieces. He said,
"Am I a god with the power to bring death or life, that I get orders to heal this man from this disease? What's going on here? That king's trying to pick a fight. That's what."
Now Elisha, the man of God, heard what had happened, that the king of Israel was so distressed that he'd ripped his robes to shreds. He sent word to the king,
"Why are you so upset, ripping your robe like this? Send him to me, so he'll learn that there's a prophet in Israel."
So Naaman with his horses and chariots arrived in style and stopped at Elisha's door. Elisha sent out a servant to meet him with this message:
"Go to the river Jordan and immerse yourself 7 times. Your skin will be healed, and you'll be as good as new."
Naaman lost his temper. He spun around, saying,
"I thought he'd personally come out and meet me, call on the name of God, wave his hand over the diseased spot and get rid of the disease. The Damascus rivers, Abana and Pharpar, are clearer by far than any of the rivers in Israel. Why not bathe in them? I'd at least get clean."
He stomped off, mad as a hornet. But his servants caught up with him and said, "Father, if the prophet had asked you to do something hard and heroic, wouldn't you have done it? So why not this simple Wash and be clean. So he did it. He went down and immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times, following the orders of the holy man. His skin was healed. It was like the skin of a little baby. He was as good as new. He then went back to the holy man. He and his entourage stood before him and said,
I now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no God anywhere on earth other than the God of Israel.
Thank you very much. It brings it to life, doesn't it, when you've got a bit more modern translation and the interacting voices there. So if you did want to have a look at it, the story carries on after that, but we're just going to concentrate on this bit. It's in 2 Kings chapter 5, and if you wanted to look at it, it's on page 372. You might want to look at it later or read the rest of the story. So those of you who know me know that I like to anchor things in time and space. So we've got a bit of geography. Sue will be happy. A bit of geography and a bit of historical context here. So Elisha was God's prophet. He succeeded Elijah. He was God's prophet from around 848 to 797 BC. And the united kingdom of David and Solomon got split into 2 after Solomon died. And we had the northern kingdom, which is in orange on the map there. It's the northern kingdom of Israel. That was 10 of the 12 tribes. And the capital was Samaria. There, I've just marked it on there. And the southern kingdom of Judah, which is in the purple bit down at the bottom. And the capital there was Jerusalem. And there was plenty of problems between those 2 kingdoms, as you can imagine, as well as the other nations that were around there. And Aram is the old name for Syria, and the capital was Damascus, and it still is Damascus. And the events of this story take place around 845 BC, and Joram was the king of Israel, and the king of Aram was probably Ben-Hadad II. I found that out from my study Bible. I didn't know it already, so it was something new that I learned. So although a peace treaty had been brokered between Israel and Aram in the time of the previous king Ahab, the infamous king Ahab, who had that dreadful wife Jezebel, there were minor border skirmishes after that, and after Ahab had been killed in a battle for one of the towns. So presumably this little Israelite girl had been captured by the Arameans in one of those border raids. So much for the history and the geography. Now let's come to the characters. This is the interesting bit now. First of all, the main character in this story, or is Naaman. And he was the commander of the Syrian army. And as we read this story, I think we see he was obviously a very good soldier. And he was very highly valued by his master, the king. And he seemed to be generally very well liked and respected. But he had a big problem. He had leprosy or a skin disease of some kind. It may or may not have been the leprosy that we understand as a disease today. Now, it wasn't just in Jewish law that lepers were made to be outsiders. That was widespread in the cultures and civilizations of the time. And people with skin diseases were shunned by society. They were made outcasts. And the people thought that they had been rejected by their God. So they're in a pretty bad state. And in terms of the Old Testament Jewish understanding, Naaman had to be kept outside the camp, if we go back to the Exodus days, on 2 fronts. Firstly, he was not a Jew, he was a Gentile. And secondly, he was a leper. So he was definitely persona non grata. And we'll come back to him a bit later on. So the next character in the story is the Israelite girl. I don't know how old she was, but the passage says that she was young. Now imagine being taken captive from your home as a little child, away from your family, made to be a servant in a foreign land. It still happens today, doesn't it? Remember the Chibok girls in Nigeria? That was 9 years ago. This little girl doesn't have many lines in our story, but from what she says, I think she was treated well by Naaman's wife. And she probably liked Naaman too. Perhaps he was kind to her. She certainly felt sorry for him, and she wanted to help him. So one day she plucked up enough courage to tell her mistress about her God and the prophet who could cure Naaman of his disease. Though she was far away from home, she was very much aware of God's saving presence with his people through Elisha. And she shared that knowledge with her Aramean captors. Talk about love your enemies. Then we get the two kings. Now, the king of Aram obviously valued Naaman very highly, and he readily agreed to Naaman going to see Elisha. But he thought, as the understanding of the time, he thought that Naaman needed to go to the king of Israel first, because he'd assumed that the prophet was under the authority of the king, and his services could be bought by a very large gift, as was the custom of the time. Now, it's hard for us to imagine just how big this gift was that he sent with Naaman. Now, I looked this up. The current price of gold is over £1,500 per ounce, or £50 per gram if you're into metric. So taking £150 of the stuff, that's about 80 kilos of gold, at the current prices would be about 3.6 million. And the silver in comparison was only worth about £215,000. And then there were the clothes as well. The total gift was worth about the combined annual wages of 600 labourers. It's not a trivial amount, is it, really? So I think the king of Aram thought an awful lot about Naaman. Joram, the king of Israel, was so distressed when he received the entourage that he tore his clothes to bits. And what the king of Aram was asking him to do was something that only a divine being could do. And he suspected that the king of Aram was trying to provoke a war, so he went into panic mode. A far cry from that little servant girl, he didn't even give God a thought, did he? Not like the little girl. Then we get Elisha. He doesn't feature too much in this story either. He's heard, but he's not seen. And he sends messages to Joram and then to Naaman to tell them what he needed to do. Now, people of the nations of the Middle East at that time would have expected that Elisha would have come out in all his pomp and ceremony, and he'd have performed some very special magic rituals. And Naaman expected that, and he expected the physical presence of Elisha was necessary to accomplish this healing, or the magic wouldn't work. And Elisha was very keen to distance himself from that sort of idea, and he wanted only God to get the glory. So he didn't come out, he just sent a message. And then we get Naaman's attendants. Now, Naaman was fuming, wasn't he? Naaman was fuming at Elisha's response. He ranted and he raved and he threw all his toys out of the pram, and he'd expected a big fuss. But he was simply told to go and dip himself in the Jordan, that horrible, fiddly, mucky river, 7 times. What a farce, he thought. I think the reaction of those attendants is absolutely wonderful. They probably sort of ran away and hid for a bit till he calmed down as he was ranting and raving. But They obviously liked and respected their commander. And they didn't want him to come all that way and achieve nothing. So they bravely challenged him, and they got him to see sense. And they encouraged Naaman to give it a go. And Naaman was healed. And more than that, he realized that the God of Israel really was God. So, conclusion. Keeping it simple. We've had a lot of simple things this morning, and it is simple. So the first thing is the young Israelite girl. She was very simple and uncomplicated in her own faith. She simply said, "My God can cure my master," through the prophet Elijah. She simply pointed Naaman in the right direction. Then there was Naaman's wife. She simply passed that message on. Naaman, he really needed pushing. He was desperate for healing, and he was desperate to be readmitted to society. But he had some preconceived ideas about how that was going to happen. And he couldn't accept being told to do something simple. He was trying to rely on his own credentials and on a religious formula of some kind. And he needed pushing. But in the end, he backed down. He put his pride aside. He exercised simple faith and did what was asked of him. And then we have Naaman's attendants. They just simply encouraged Naaman to do what he'd been asked to do. So we've got these various characters. There are other characters in the story, but these are the ones that I sort of picked out. And over the last 5 weeks, we've been having an opportunity for a discussion time. So Alan and I said we'd like to continue that and give you a chance to have a little chat. So I've come up with some questions, and please don't feel that you have to take all of them or you have to take them all in order. Just look at the questions and decide what speaks to you most, what you want to talk about in your little groups, and just get organized. So here are the questions. And first of all, is that clear enough to read? The first one, who do you identify with in this story? Do you identify with the little servant girl who sort of just points people in the right direction, or what? Who do you identify with in that story, and why? That might be a question that you'd like to talk about. If you are already a Christian, can you think of times when you have pointed someone in the right direction to find Jesus for themselves? Have you ever been able to give anyone an encouragement or a push just to take a step of faith in some situation? Can you think of an example of that? And then if you're not yet a Christian, if you're still wondering, are you a bit like Naaman? Do you think that you've got to come to God by some complicated method or some ritual formula, rather than just simply believing in Jesus? And are you prepared simply to accept? So take your pick of the questions that are up there. We've got plenty of time, I think, for have a discussion. And then I think Alan's going to bring us back together with some prayer at the end. Is that right? Right.